So far in this course, we focused a lot on verbs and their importance in a sentence. We've spoken about all the tenses, active and passive voice, conditionals, and many other topics that center around verbs. Now, that's because verbs truly are the core of the English language. A sentence is not a sentence without a verb, even if that verb is as simple as the word is. But there is so much more to verbs than just their role as verbs. Verbs can be transformed in ways you may have never realized, but most definitely will be able to use in your own writing and speaking. As usual, before we kick off this lesson, we're going to discuss the Lesson 5 challenge together. Your Lesson 5 challenge was all about punctuation. I asked you to complete this paragraph by filling in the correct punctuation marks. There are 3 types of sentences: simple, compound, and complex. If you understand clauses, you'll improve your sentence forming skills. Now, after what you learned in Lesson 5, you may have noticed that there are quite a few punctuation marks missing from these 2 sentences. Let's see if you were able to turn your knowledge into practical skills. Let's discuss the answers together. Have a look at what I've got here. Now, first, let's talk about that long dash. Do you remember why we use long dashes? Well, a long dash can be used for one of 2 reasons. Firstly, a long dash separates a part of a sentence that gives extra information. But that's not the reason I used a long dash here. The other reason why we use long dashes is to separate the conclusion of a sentence for emphasis. Now, the conclusion is just another word for an ending or the last part of something. In this case, the sentence is building up to the conclusion: simple, compound, and complex. I could have used a colon instead, but I wanted to emphasize the 3 types of sentences, so I used a long dash for that emphasis I was looking for. Now, have a look at those 2 commas that separate simple, compound, and complex. Essentially, those 3 words are items in a list, and as we discussed in Lesson 5, commas are used to separate items in a list. Take particular note of that comma just before the word and. Do you remember what we call that comma? It's the Oxford comma, and we use it to avoid ambiguity or confusion. Very important. Now, let's have a look at that next comma. What's that comma doing? Because it definitely isn't separating items in a list. It's separating clauses. Remember, this is a complex sentence, and we know that from the subordinating conjunction if. Since the subordinate clause is before the independent clause, we have to use a comma to separate the clauses. Now, if you don't quite understand the clauses and the types of sentences yet, you can always go back to Lesson 5 to recap. Now, let's look at that apostrophe. Do you remember why we use apostrophes? In this case, I've used the apostrophe to show contraction. The word you will has undergone the process of contraction, meaning that it has been shortened, and I added an apostrophe in the part of the word where letters have been deleted. And lastly, let's have a look at that hyphen. You'll remember from Lesson 5 that we call that a hyphenated compound. 2 words that have been joined together by a hyphen. Now, why did I hyphenate sentence forming? Well, this compound adjective consists of a noun and a present participle. And most importantly, it appears before the noun skills. So we have to hyphenate it. If it appeared after the noun, we wouldn't have needed to hyphenate it. How did you do? Did you get the punctuation right? Remember that if you have any questions, or if you would like to discuss some of the challenges you may have come across while doing this challenge, you can always contact us at support@shawacademy.com and I will answer any questions that you may have. Now let's get into our lesson for today. Lesson 6, Word Transformers. By the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to describe 4 types of verb transformations. You'll also be able to transform verbs into other parts of speech. Lastly, you'll be able to write and speak about abstract concepts. In particular, what we're looking at today will be 4 different types of verb transformations. We're going to start by discussing infinitives, something that may ring a bell for you already, but if not, that's okay, because we will be going into some detail about it today. Then, we're going to look at gerunds. Nominalizations will be next. And finally, we'll end off this lesson by discussing participles. Now, these all may sound like very big and confusing words for you if this is the first time you're hearing about them. But don't worry, because I will talk you through it one by one. And by the end of this lesson, you will have confidence in your understanding of these verb transformations. Now, you may be wondering, what is a verb transformation? Well, a verb transformation is when a verb changes into a different part of speech. In this lesson, we'll look at verbs that change into adjectives, and we'll look at verbs that change into nouns. Let's discuss why verb transformations are actually important for us to understand. It's wonderful to be able to speak and write about actions like walking, talking, driving, and so on. But we do eventually want to move beyond the point of talking about concrete actions and objects and start talking about concepts, abstract ideas. For example, academic writing and other types of formal writing are often mostly focused on abstract concepts. What I mean by abstract concepts is ideas about things that we can't touch or see. Verb transformations actually give us the opportunity to speak about such concepts, and that's why it's important to know and understand verb transformations. So I'm sure you are excited to dive straight into our first type of verb transformation, infinitives. Since some of you may have been exposed to infinitives before, perhaps in the early stages of your English learning journey, I want to ask you, what is an infinitive? Do you know? Well, it's quite simple actually. An infinitive is the base form of the verb, meaning that they are the simplest verb form. You'll remember we used the verb base forms a lot when we were discussing conditionals earlier in this module. However, infinitives start with the word to. Also, infinitives have no tense, and they are not bound to a particular subject like regular verbs are. Let's look at some examples of infinitives. To walk, to go, to encounter, to discuss. Can you see that the verbs are in their base forms? Do you see the word to before the verbs? I'd like to demonstrate the role that the infinitive plays in a sentence. But first, we're going to look at a regular sentence without an infinitive. Have a look at this sentence. I love books. This is quite a normal, simple sentence. It contains a subject, I, which is of course a noun, and a verb, love, as well as an object, books, which we know is a noun. It's quite normal for English active sentences to follow the subject-verb-object structure. Now we're going to change the sentence a little. We still have I love, which is our subject and verb. But now I've replaced the last part of the sentence with an infinitive, to read. Is it still an object? Surely not though, because it's a verb, right? Can verbs be objects? Well, it's a little more complicated than you'd think. The infinitive in this instance actually plays the role of an object. In fact, it plays the role of a noun, not a verb. The difference between this sentence and the previous sentence is that we're no longer talking about a concrete noun, books. We're talking about a concept, the idea of reading, rather than the concrete action of it. And that's what this verb transformation allows us to do. Let's look at the next verb transformation, gerunds. A gerund is a word that ends in ing, and also, much like the infinitive, plays the role of a noun. An example of a gerund is walking. Now, you may be thinking back to our last lesson where we spoke a little about present participles. And you may be thinking that this looks exactly like a present participle. And also, strangely enough, it looks exactly like the present continuous tense form of a verb. What is going on here? Why do all these word forms look exactly the same? Well, before we get into how gerunds function as a sentence, I would like to discuss with you the difference between gerunds, present participles, and present continuous tense. Firstly, a gerund plays the role of a noun in a sentence, as you've just learned. The present participle, on the other hand, plays the role of an adjective. And you already know present continuous tense from Module 1, Lesson 6. It's just a regular verb. But all of this might be going over your head right now because we haven't really spoken about present participles much. But we will get into that later in this lesson. For now, all I really want you to do is look at these different words and see that they look exactly the same, since they all end in ing, but note that they are not the same, because they don't play the same role in a sentence. Just because words look similar don't mean that they have the same function. They are all different parts of speech, and you need to look at words in the context that you found them in. Now, I'd like to demonstrate the role that the gerund plays in a sentence. We're going to look at the same regular sentence from earlier. I love books. We know that it contains a subject and a verb, as well as an object, books, which we know, of course, is a noun. Now, once again, we're going to change the sentence a little. We still have I love, which is our subject and verb, but now I've replaced the last part of the sentence with a gerund this time, reading. Just like the infinitive, the gerund plays the role of an object, even though it looks like a verb. It plays the role of a noun. So, as you can see, the gerund and the infinitive play very similar roles in a sentence. Let's take a quick break to talk about Lesson 7. You know the drill by now. Lesson 7 is your reading lesson. You're going to be given the opportunity to practice your reading skills once again, IELTS style. This will prepare you not only for the IELTS tests, but also for whenever you need to read lots of text in your day-to-day life. I look forward to seeing you there. Okay, back to our verb transformations. Next, we're going to talk about nominalizations. Now, what exactly is a nominalization? Quite a big word, I must confess, but it's a simple concept to grasp. Just like infinitives and gerunds, a nominalization also plays the role of a noun. It's a verb that has been transformed into a noun. But, unlike infinitives and gerunds, a nominalization undergoes a slightly different process to change into a noun. Have a look at this example. The verb act has been transformed into a noun, action. All we had to do is add the letters I-O-N to the verb and it became a noun. But it's not always so simple. There are a few nominalization processes. We'll look at 3 types you may recognize. Remember when we spoke about suffixes in Module 1? Suffixes are endings that we add to words to change or alter the meaning. The first 2 of these points are some of the suffixes that we can add to the end of verbs to change them into nouns. Take a moment to see if you've ever seen these suffixes before. These are all quite common, and I'm sure you've seen them before, even if you didn't realize it at the time. We're now going to look at these suffixes one by one. Starting with T-I-O-N, this might look a little strange to you, but once you see the examples, you'll realize how common it actually is. And before we continue, I want to draw your attention to the fact that despite its strange spelling, it's pronounced shin. We already know that English spelling is rather odd, so nothing new here. First, we have the verb organize in I organize parties. Let's see how it can function as a noun in a sentence. I work for an animal rights organization. Can you see how shin has been added to the verb to turn it into a noun? You might also notice that the letter A was added. Now, that's just to make the suffix fit onto the base form better. You can see it kind of like glue. If you don't know what an organization is, it's a group of people that have joined together for a common purpose. So this is quite an abstract concept. Next, have a look at the verb correct in the sentence. I correct people's grammar. Once again, we can add the suffix to this verb to turn it into a noun. But this time we'll just add ION because the verb correct already ends in the letter T. So there is no need to add another T. That's just too many T's. Correction isn't always a good thing. The first sentence, I correct people's grammar, is about a concrete action, and it's quite factual. Nothing too special about it. But with this sentence, I'm starting to speak about more abstract concepts. I'm now speaking about the idea of correction and that it isn't always good. I'm expressing an opinion. I'm using language to show my higher order thinking skills. Let's look at one more example. Look at the verb introduce in we introduce people to be polite. Now let's look at the transformation. Module 1 is an introduction to grammar. Once again, we've gone from speaking about a concrete action in the first sentence to more of a concept in the second sentence. Isn't it great how a suffix can do that? Another suffix that has a similar effect is mint. Once again, I just want to draw your attention to the pronunciation. Even though you see the letter E and you might want to say meant, it's actually pronounced mint. Let's look at some examples of the suffix in action. Look at the verb judge here in the sentence. I don't judge people based on their appearance. Now, look at how the noun has changed from judge to judgment in this sentence. Judgment based on someone's appearance is rude. The nominalization in the second sentence allows us to express an opinion and talk about an abstract idea rather than talk about a concrete action. Next, look at the verb pay in the sentence, I always pay my rent on time. See how it's transformed in the next sentence. I appreciate your early payment. This nominalization has allowed us to express an emotion about an abstract concept, payment. Let's look at one more example. I agree with everyone. Let's look at how the verb has changed to a noun through the process of nominalization in the next sentence. We must come to an agreement in this meeting. While some words undergo the nominalization process through suffixes, other words simply stay the same. They are just used differently in the sentence. Let's look at some examples. We always wait to see the doctor. Now in the next sentence, you'll notice that the verb wait stays the same, but it's now used as a noun. I'm sorry for the long wait. Same as the sentence, I sleep well every night. Sleep can be used as a noun too. It's important to get lots of sleep every night. Another example is, I drive far to work every day, where the verb drive can actually be changed to a noun by simply using it differently. The long drive to work can be quite unpleasant. Notice how in the first column of sentences, where verbs are used normally, the sentences are more factual, and to be honest, they're not very expressive or emotional. However, in the second column of sentences, where the verbs are used as nouns, emotions or opinions are being expressed. As you know, that's what verb transformations and particularly nominalizations are all about. Now, we spoke a bit about participles earlier in this lesson, and we also briefly touched on it in the last lesson when we discussed hyphenated compounds. Now it's time to zoom in and see how participles function in sentences. Participles are slightly different to the other word transformations we've covered today. The other word transformations functioned as nouns in a sentence. But a participle usually plays the role of an adjective in a sentence. There are, of course, exceptions, like there always seem to be in English, but we won't be focusing on these exceptions today. We will be covering two types of participles today: present participles and past participles. Earlier in this lesson, we briefly spoke about how present participles are different from gerunds and the present continuous tense, because truly they look exactly the same, and this can make it a little bit confusing. They all end in the suffix ing. But, as you know, the present participle usually functions as an adjective, and that's why it's different from gerunds and the present continuous tense. An example is the word running in I saw a running dog at the park. The word running is used to describe the noun dog, and therefore it's an adjective, even though it kind of looks like a verb. Let me elaborate on the role of a present participle in a sentence. We'll start by looking at a regular adjective, lovely, in the lovely children. We know that it's an adjective because it modifies or gives more information about the noun, children. Now, look at that. I changed the adjective to reading. That's not a gerund. That's not a verb in present continuous tense. That's a present participle. Why? Because it ends in the suffix ing and it plays the role of an adjective. It gives more information about the noun, children. Next, we have the past participle. The past participle has exactly the same function as the present participle. It functions as an adjective. But then, what's the difference? Well, the past participle has the same form as the verb 3 tense form. We're going to look at some examples in a bit, but I just quickly want to explain the concept of verb 3 to those of you who may not remember from previous lessons. You probably know by now that we have a lot of irregular verbs in English. That is, verbs that don't behave in the same way as regular verbs. They look a little different when we put them in certain tenses, like perfect tenses. Have a look at this table. Do you see the part in pink? Those are the verb 3 forms of a verb. Verb 3 is typically used for perfect tenses, but the verb 3 form is also used for the past participle. Now, I don't want you to get confused here. The past participle is not a tense. As you know, participles function as adjectives. And can adjectives have tense? No, not at all. Only verbs can have tense. The past participle simply looks like it has tense. Let me elaborate on the role of a past participle in a sentence. We'll start by looking at a regular adjective, delicious, in the delicious toast. We know that it's an adjective because it modifies, or in other words, it gives more information about the noun, toast. Now I've changed the adjective to burnt. That is a past participle. That's because it's in the verb 3 form and it plays the role of an adjective. It gives more information about the noun, toast. It tells us that the toast has been left in the toaster for too long. It's now burnt. All right, it's time for your lesson challenge. For this lesson's challenge, I'd like to ask you to give an example of how a verb transformation can help us speak about abstract concepts. This challenge will help you develop your own examples of how verb transformations can make your writing and speaking stand out by helping you communicate your higher order thinking.